Good morning, everyone. I am just checking to see if you can hear me clearly. All right, perfect. So we are going to be starting. Good morning, everyone. Are you able to hear me now? I was speaking just a while ago.
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. Are you now able to see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. I'm gonna ask you to just use the raise hand function or the mic feature when you are making a point or gonna ask a question. I am not able to see the chat at the moment, so just gonna ask you just to use the raise hand function so I can acknowledge you accordingly. So a brief introduction is in order. My name is David Salmon. I'm a third year, I just completed third year at the University of the West Indies. I am a public policy and management student. I am a Gleaner news reporter and a columnist and the executive director of the New Jamaica Foundation. Essentially, this organization is designed to provide opportunities for young people, and this is why we're here having our session, our Caribbean study session today. So if you have any questions throughout the process, if you want further clarification, I encourage you to go and seek clarification when needed. I can answer the questions that you may have and also provide experiences if you prefer based on my own experience as someone who works professionally in the media landscape, as well as someone who has done the subject, got one with a straight A profile, and someone who can share different experiences professionally. So without further ado, we're going to get into have some brief ground rules so everyone can be on the same page. If you're not speaking, I'm kindly asking you to mute your mic, as it can sometimes be very, very distracting sometimes when you're making a presentation or someone's making a point and the mic goes off. Secondly, please be respectful in the chat. There's an opportunity for everyone to be here to learn, to develop a deeper understanding of the subject, of the Caribbean studies subject, and it's all a learning opportunity. No experience is a bad one, and I am imploring you to be involved and to get active in the session. Thirdly, please do not take screenshots of individuals in the meeting. Respect is in order, and thus we don't want anyone to be taking any pictures of anyone in the chat. Lastly, use the raise hand function or chat to communicate questions. As I said before, I'm not able to see your screen, not able to see the chat function. So I'm asking for everyone just to go and raise their hand or use the chat function accordingly. So without further ado, I'm just gonna ask everyone, how are you feeling today? What are your expectations of the session? So I may know how to respond accordingly if needs be. Any takers? Please use the mic. What are your expectations? What do you hope to achieve at the end of the session? Yes, Jean-Marie.
Good morning, sir. And can I just commend you actually pronounced my name correct? I just really expect to know how to write, to be able to write essays efficiently at the end of the session, because that's the biggest challenge for me. Like I know the material, I know the content, but it's actual application.
All right, perfect. We are going to actually, at the end of the session, really discuss essay writing tips, as that's a very, very important point. A lot of the essays are a lot of some of the questions we're going through ask you to argue your points. And this is something that could be daunting at first, but that's certainly something that we'll be going through accordingly. Just to add some more experience, I am somebody who has debated professionally at the international level. So I will also share some strategies that I learned in debating in these sessions to help you to have a well-meaningful and well-constructed argument. So let's move right ahead. So the first topic that came on the revision document is really the historical process or movement towards emancipation. You'll find that in these sessions, you are not just going to get content, because persons can have the content, you can read the content. But the important thing is that you know what an examiner is looking for when you are doing your essay. That is the most important thing. So as a consequence of that, it's important that we look at the syllabus. What does the syllabus expect us to do? Firstly, the syllabus is structured in a way where you're supposed to really engage with the subject matter and talk about the different movements towards independence. That includes political enfranchisement, adult suffrage, internal self-government, economic enfranchisement, entrepreneurial activities, including shopkeeping and saving societies. However, before I continue, I'm just encouraging everyone. There was a slight technical difficulties this morning. So the link was sent or was emailed. The link for sociology was emailed to some of the Caribbean students. So if you have a friend who is not currently in this session, or if you're a sociology student that really should be in that session, I'm just kind of going to ask you to go and use the link. If you're a sociology student, use the link that was sent to you earlier. Or if you're a Caribbean student, ensure to use the link in the WhatsApp group. All right, so with that said, let's continue. So now since we have looked at what the syllabus is requiring of us to do, let's get into our past paper question. So the question is, internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean. Discuss the extent to which you agree with this statement. So I'm going to open the floor for you all here today. What are your initial thoughts about the question? And please, this is meant to be a very interactive session. So at this point in time, we're just building up on the knowledge that we currently have. What are your thoughts for the session? Or what are your thoughts on the question, rather? Yes, Sherige.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So, firstly, I will do an introduction. So, I'm sorry. So, I will define internal self-government and how it is important to the Caribbean for the introduction.
All right, great. So yes, you're supposed to show the importance of internal self-governance and how it's important to the Caribbean. That's so important, certainly. I believe this is Michaela. Yes, Michaela, what are your thoughts on the question?
Good morning, sir. So my first thoughts were, I do believe internal self-government was important, but it said the most important. And I think movements such as political enfranchisement, it really was a factor that led to internal self-government being something that would be considered later on. So because of that, I don't think internal self-government was the most important, because other movements were there that paved the way for that. So those movements before would have a little more clout than internal self-government. I guess that was my initial thoughts.
You have raised Absolutely fabulous point, Michaela. You see, this question is valid 30 marks. It's not one of the 20 marks question. The 20 marks question gives you basic understanding. So explain, describe, analyze. Well, just explain and describe or depict. This is asking you to discuss. And as Michaela had just said, you are required to have a position on it. There's no position that is wrong, just to be very certain, but you must have a position. So you cannot only speak about what is internal self-governance or what is political enfranchisement, but you're required to take a position to say whether it was the most important or the least important, or whether it's impossible to say which one was the most important. All of those factors are extremely important. Let's look at the subject report. Essentially, the subject report is how to put it down? The subject report is a document produced at the end of each examination, which shows or gives a basic overview of how the students in that year answered that particular question. It is extremely useful and extremely helpful because you're able to know from an examiner's perspective what exactly did students do well or what they did not do well or what they could improve on. So I quoted the subject report here, which says, many candidates who attempted this question seem to have historical knowledge of internal self-governance, or government rather. They were, however, unable to apply it effectively to the question. It was also evident that candidates did not understand that internal self-government was applicable to the British West Indies. Now, moving on to the next slide. The report also said that candidates ignored the section of the question which required them to discuss the extent to which they agreed with the statement. Candidates had difficulty with chronology and therefore focused on the period after independence, which is not self-governance. Some did not have an understanding of key concepts, for example, emancipation, independence, and internal self-government. And as a result, these were used interchangeably in their responses. So we start to see now the importance of not only understanding the definition of the internal self-government, but also important to understand the argumentation and the clarification of the key terms. So if another question thrown out to the group, if you were going to answer this question, how would you go about doing it? Yes, Zidane.
Right. So good morning, everybody. The first thing I do is to take a stance. So I'd agree to an extent, that it is the most important thing. As I think Smith said earlier, there are other things that led to this unfolding. And one of the things that came to my mind is that you can have you can have self-government and not have political enfranchisement. So I'd agree to an extent that it is the most important thing. However, I'd expound that there are others which had same magnitude, which were also important.
All right, thank you for sharing, Zidane. Yes, Michaela.
So yes, I agree with Zidane, but instead of starting off with my stance first, I would probably use the introduction to define the terms that they said, like they mentioned in the question. So internal self-government and whatever keywords that I think would have been important in that particular essay. And then I would go into what Zidane was saying, which is state my stance and then start to develop my points as to why I took that stance.
Good points, everyone. So both of you are in fact correct. However, the structure that we need to now look at is to start out with your definition and then you go into your points. In debating, we call this the clarification of the key terms, because when you're making an argument, you need to know that everyone is on the same page with the debate or with the points that you're going to raise. So you start with clarification of the key terms. You start with your definition and the context. That is important. The first step is to outline the process of internal self-government. So you outline a definition, you show the process. You see, internal self-government is the right of a people to govern themselves without external interference. That's the definition. It is the right of a people to govern themselves without external interference. The process was a precursor. It came before. It heralded the independence movement within the British West Indies, and that is very, very important. French colonies like Haiti did not go through a period of internal self-government. You had the Haitian War for Independence, and then they became independent. So there was no period of self-government. Other territories did not have that process as well. So it was important that you mentioned this took place within the British West Indies. So you have defined the key term. Internal self-government is the right of the people to govern themselves without external interference. And then you see it took place within the British West Indies. From there, it is essential that you mention the process that facilitated the development of internal self-government. So many of you would have shared that you would have spoken about the importance of political enfranchisement under universal adult suffrage, or that you would have spoken about other movements towards independence. However, it is extremely useful that you kind of bring in these different concepts so you get knowledge, usage of knowledge. That is incredibly important because you are marked based on your usage of knowledge and your analysis and information that you present. So if you can find a way to bring in the different concepts that you know, such as universal adult suffrage, then you're moving towards the one. Most importantly, it is also necessary that you recognize your examples. This is a Caribbean example. So don't speak about internal self-governance broadly, bring in your examples as well. So looking at what universal self-government, universal adult suffrage is, you see universal adult suffrage is the situation where all males and females 21 years of older now had the right to vote. This took place across different years in the British-speaking Caribbean, but in similar time periods. So in Jamaica, 1944, Trinidad and Tobago, 1945, Barbados, 1950, and British Guyana, 1953. If you can share those examples, then you are doing well. You're showing that you know the concept, you know the topic. So we know that people have an understanding of their own respective territories, but we need to also recognize that it is important you don't only share from your country's perspective. Average students will share from your country's perspective, but we have above average and exceptional students at this session, and they can now bring in the different examples. Then you look at how universal adult suffrage, which is a starter, provided the opportunity for the public to elect representatives that would lobby for the improvement of their interests. Very important. Previously, you had crown colony governance, where you had a governor sent from the United Kingdom that was responsible for all matters of affairs. If you had any representative, if you had any body that was elected, they were elected by the plantocracy or the plantation class, and it was not a franchise available to the wider public. However, internal universal adult suffrage ensured that you have the vast majority of people now being able to vote, regardless of their race, regardless of their class, whether they own property or not. So universal adult suffrage directly contributes to the process of internal self-governance. So you have your introduction where you're given the definitions and such. Then you look at the position that you're going to take. But before that, it's important to provide the context, the opportunities where people had to elect their representatives. Then, no, it's also important that you see how internal self-government contributed or facilitated the emergence of the political parties. That is important because internal self-government was a system where you had local representatives for the first time being responsible for the decisions taken at the national level, with the exception of defense and foreign policy. So again, the average student will simply share the main political parties in their country. But I know that we have students from other Caribbean territories. That's why I've added examples here. And you can also pick, choose and refuse from. So from Jamaica, you had the People's National Party, which was Jamaica's first largest successful political party. And then you had the Jamaica Labour Party, which came right after. In Barbados, you had the Barbados Progressive League, founded by Grantley Adams. In Guyana, then you had the People's Progressive Party, founded by Chedi Jagan. And in Trinidad and Tobago, you had the People's National Movement, founded by Eric Williams. So we see how the different political parties have started to be shaped by the process of internal self-government. As stated before, under internal self-government, the authority of the governor, which existed under Crown Colony rule, was replaced by elected representatives. Now you either had a chief minister, premier, or first minister, and the cabinet controlled domestic affairs within the colony. The exception goes with foreign affairs and defense. Before I continue, do we have any questions, or are we clear? Any questions, anyone?
No, sir.
All right, not seeing any hands. All right, so I think we are all clear. So let's move on. So we have established the context, we have established the key terms, and then now we see the importance of establishing the position. The position is important. The subject report would have expounded on that, where it said candidates were, however, unable to apply knowledge effectively. So candidates would have the knowledge, but now they need to use the knowledge. And they ignored the section of the question which required them to discuss the extent to which they agree with the statement. Internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean. The question is, do you agree? Do you disagree? How strongly do you agree? So you must state your position. I'm inviting persons who may have different perspectives to share now, just asking everyone. If you agree with the statement, just use the raise hand function you can raise your hand. So if you agree with the statement that internal self-governance was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean, please raise your hands. All right, we see a number of hands. All right, so you can lower your hands now. If you disagree that internal self-government was not the most important movement towards independence, you can raise your hands. All right, perfect. You can lower your hands now. If you are on the fence or you're not quite sure how to tackle the question, or let's say you're two-minded, you can raise your hand. All right, great. So the vast majority of persons here are not quite certain if they can take a position, whether you would say that it was the most important movement or the less important, or there are other factors. But we're going to be tackling that. I'm going to be presenting you different arguments that you can take from the different spectrum or the different discussion points that you can raise in the topic. So let's move right ahead. If you agree with the statement and you strongly agree that internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence, there are some key arguments that you can use. This topic is not particularly difficult to handle. You just have to know how to apply the knowledge. So I would assume most persons here would know their country's own respective countries' founding fathers. And you can argue that internal self-government was the most important movement because it facilitated the emergence of political leaders that led the former colonies towards independence. So, for example, before you had universal adult suffrage, Norman Manley, which is from Jamaica, was a gifted barrister, but that was just it. He was a Rhodes Scholar, gifted barrister, had a very prominent reputation in Jamaica, and that was the extent of his placement or position in society. However, leading up to universal adult suffrage, he played a key role in the founding of the People's National Party. Then, by 1955, he became chief minister, and subsequently he became premier. So what do we see here? Internal self-government, if you believe that it is the most important movement towards independence, we could argue it has facilitated the emergence of political leaders. Each country has their own different leader that contributed. So you had Eric Williams from Trinidad, gifted scholar and historian. You have Grantley Adams as well, who played his role in Barbados. So it led to the emergence of political leaders of these former colonies. That's one point you can use, and you can build a whole paragraph out of that one point. Then you could look at another point and say, yes, internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean because it contributed to the development of institutions that facilitated independence. So now you can look at, for example, the emergence of cabinet government. That's what we currently have here, where you have the prime minister, who is the head of cabinet, and leads different ministers who are elected or appointed by the Senate, who then lead respective government departments themselves. So we saw the emergence of institutions. So the leadership is one, but we also saw the institutions is another. I'm going to look at a book here, and I can read briefly from the book so you have a bit of content. This book is Norman Washington Manley and the Making of Modern Jamaica. It's written by historian Arnold Bertram. And in the appendix of the book, he would have outlined the early cabinet, the House of Representatives, and the positions of the different cabinet ministers during the time of internal self-government within Jamaica. So, for instance, if we are just looking at the idea of cabinet, let me go right in it there. You will see that for the first time, you had different government ministers responsible for various portfolio areas. So, for example, you had Noel Nethersole, who served previously as the finance minister. You would have had individuals like Florzel Glasspool, who would have served in cabinet. So you would have seen where there are different persons who are serving in these respective government departments, are serving in these institutions. And another point that you can raise earlier to show how internal self-government was so important is that it facilitated the opportunity for average Caribbean citizens to play a leading role in electoral politics. So for instance, if we're just looking at the House of Representatives in Jamaica now, just to be specific, we're just looking at Jamaica now, you could see where just from the House of Representatives 1949 to 1955, you had a gentleman named Edwin Allen, who was an educator. You had someone named Isaac Barrant, who was a shopkeeper or trade unionist. Or you have persons who were contractors or planters or different individuals. So what we see now is we see more representative form of government. So it facilitated the leaders. It facilitated institutions such as cabinet. It also facilitated to a concept called colonial disengagement, as domestic leaders became more and more responsible for local affairs. That's an important point, because you know the syllabus asks you to look at not just internal self-government in abstract, but how did it contribute to independence? How did it lead to this process? What we saw is Britain pulling back from what it normally used to do, and more authority or responsibility going to local leaders. So it helped to facilitate the decolonization process. You can do a whole argument about that, because you can mention crown colony governance in your own respective territories. And then you can look at now how you have individuals responsible for their own local affairs. And eventually you had full independence. Then you also can see how it facilitated the independence of Caribbean citizens, as Caribbean citizens could now express their dissatisfaction with colonial administration. We start to see the importance of democracy. People can now share their voice. So if you are in an essay and you get a question of a similar nature and you're wondering, how do I respond to this? And say, all right, yes, internal self-government was the most important thing. Look at your country now and see where would these institutions or individuals would have come from, or these political parties would have come from, and then you can use that to build your essay. So the current leader of the Jamaica Labour Party is Andrew Holness, who now serves as Prime Minister. The Jamaica Labour Party existed before independence and was in government from 1944 to 1955 due to internal self-governance. If you look at the current Prime Minister of Trinidad, Keith Rowley, he is head of the People's National Movement, a political party that existed before independence that contributed to internal self-governance. So that's how you can answer it. But that is if you believe that internal self-governance was the most important movement. If you are someone who says that it was also more important than other movements, this is how you get into the realm of being exceptional students. You can give counter arguments. So you have the point, you do your context, you present your definitions, you present your position, then you show your arguments as to why we should state what you said, and then you show the counter arguments. That many students only give the argument that internal self-government was most important, but you are bright students, so you need to know what are the counter arguments along the way. So for instance, one counter argument that you could say is persons may argue that economic enfranchisement has not been realized. Or, sorry, in presenting your counter argument, you could say this: there are some who argue that economic enfranchisement has been more important than internal self-government. However, this argument does not reach the burden or the level to be considered, because in the instance where you have economic enfranchisement, this has not been fully realized. So you have cases where you have entrepreneurial activities such as the establishment of free villages or saving societies and family businesses. And this has provided opportunities for upward social mobility. But we can still suggest that the vast majority of people in respective territories have not benefited from this sort of economic enfranchisement. And that is why it can be argued that internal self-government was more important, and in fact, the most important movement towards independence, rather than another factor such as economic enfranchisement. All right, are we all clear? You can type in the chat if you're clear. Are we all clear?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
All right, great.
Wait, sir, I was holding my hand a minute, see?
Oops, sorry, was that a question?
Yeah,
Yes, Chevelle.
Yeah, could you just go over what you were saying again about, can you just go over the point again?
About the counter argument?
Yeah, can you just go over one more time, please?
All right, sure, not a problem. So because this is a 30-mark essay, you're required to take a position. And you're supposed, if you state you strongly agree that internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean, then you're supposed to state that it's the most important and explain why. But those good students can clearly expound on why internal self-government was the most important movement. But the exceptional student, the students that get placements now, are able to share their counter argument or what persons may suggest and dismiss that counter argument. So the syllabus looks at internal self-government, but it also looks at other factors as well, such as economic enfranchisement. And economic enfranchisement involves looking at entrepreneurial activities such as the free villages movement, saving societies, or family businesses. But you as the exceptional student can look at that and say, acknowledge that, yes, this is an important movement that would have contributed to economic prosperity for a group of people. However, the argument is that internal self-government was the most important movement. And it was the most important movement because economic enfranchisement has not been granted or provided for the majority of people. However, we have seen more success with internal self-government, as to this day, most English-speaking Caribbean territories are independent, despite the fact that they may not have the majority of its citizens being economically empowered. So you see, the counter argument, you can concede that there are important movements towards independence, but the exceptional students will demonstrate the knowledge of the syllabus and can dismiss a counter argument that someone could make. And that is how you move from just getting the basic knowledge marks to getting the full marks for analysis. Are we clear?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful.
All right, great. No, let's look at the other point. If no, you're going to say internal self-government was not the most important movement towards independence, here are some points you can use as well. So you can say that it can be argued that it was the emergence of the trade union movement that was the most important contribution to independence. And why can we say this is that we could say the trade union movement was the important starting point. So without the labor unrest in the 1930s, we wouldn't have the development of the political parties. And this is not an argument that is not without merit. So for instance, the two main political parties in Jamaica emerged from trade unions. Can anyone tell me what were the trade unions that were initially in place in Jamaica or in your own Caribbean territories that would have been the precursor to political parties? Yes, Dej.
For JLP would be the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, and for PMP, the National Workers Union.
Good. Yes, you are correct. Those two political movements were born from the trade union movement. As a matter of fact, there are some who argue that the case of the Jamaica Labour Party, it was really the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union that contributed to the party being mobilized and to win the 1944 general election with a landslide. So the Jamaica Labour Party essentially came from the trade union, and simply this political party was merely an extension of the trade union movement. That could be argued. So you can say that internal self-government was not the most important movement towards independence, but a trade union movement that captured the anger of people feeling dispossessed and not having their rights respected in the workplace. And as a result of the trade union movement, that is how you got political enfranchisement. You could say, and you support that with your examples. You have to bring in the examples. You support that by saying, listen, political parties, main political parties that still exist today emerged from the trade union movement. So it would be unfair to suggest that it's internal self-government was the most important factor, because this fails to recognize the important lightning rod, which was the 1930s riots that contributed to the trade union movement. As a matter of fact, the trade unions emerged first, and then you had the political parties. So that could be another argument, another example that could support your point. Many of the promises that were even given by the respective trade unions actually were a reflection of what many of the promises given by the political parties were actually a reflection of the trade union movement themselves. So you can see how that is an example of how you can use a trade union movement as the most important point, rather than the political internal self-government to push your argument. Another point that you can make is that, and this is for those persons who may be on the fence and not able to respond to the different points. Oh, before I get to that, though, another point that you could also raise if you said that internal self-government was not the most important movement towards independence is that you can break down the analysis of the trade union movement and show how many of the early leaders that would have played a very important role in the trade union movement went on to be the leaders in internal self-government. So again, you can use Bustamante, led the BITU, led the JLP, served as chief minister from 1944 to 1955, and then Jamaica's first prime minister 62 onward. Jamaica's third prime minister, Hugh Shearer, he was also a member of the BITU. So you can use those examples to support your point as well. But if you are on the fence and you're not able to take a position and you realize, okay, I'm running out of time, I still don't have a position, what are some of the things I can talk about? You could say that it is impossible to determine what was the most important movement towards emancipation, as all these other movements, such as political enfranchisement, adult suffrage, internal self-government, economic enfranchisement, and entrepreneurial activities, all played a very seminal role in the independence movement in Jamaica. You can take that point as well. You don't have to take an extreme point. You could say that you disagree with the statement because there are multiple factors that contributed to the development of independence, and it will be a travesty. It will be unfair to say that one was more important than the other, as they all represent a continuation of the reform process. So you would have had economic enfranchisement with the free village movement. Then you would have had the emergence of the trade unions that took place due to the labor riots. Then you can have adult suffrage, which produced people the right to vote, which then directly led to internal self-government, and followed subsequent to that independence. So all of these different strategies contributed to independence, rather than using just one particular strategy that made the significant difference. So that is how you can approach that argument as well. This topic is, I don't think it's a particularly challenging one. You just have to know how to go about answering the question. And for the sessions, I'm not going to go through every single past paper out there that can relate to a respective topic. I'm going to go through some key ones that I think are extremely important. And what I'm going to do then are for persons who registered via our sessions, you will get an email with these slides that you can go and revise accordingly. Because it's important that you're not bombarded with a lot of information that you feel drained and such. So I will go and send my slides to you. That those will be emailed to you, and then you can go and look at some other solutions that I will subsequently expand on. Then that you can go and revise. So now at this point in time, do we have any questions? And I'm encouraging people to ask questions. If you're not clear about something, please. All right. Yes, Chevelle, I see your hand.
Yes, hi. When you're arguing about like the multiple factors that led to independence, how would you like, for the counter arguments, how would you go about that? Because it's kind of confusing. Because like if we strongly agree, then I understand how you can counter that. But how do you counter it when you are saying that all of them play a role?
You can counter it by simply stating one would not exist without the other. So if we're looking at internal self-government, the Caribbean people didn't get up and say that they're not going to have internal self-government. You needed to have universal adult suffrage first. Then you needed the emergence of the political parties, which came from the respective trade unions. And then you had internal self-government. So it was a process, a linear process. One followed the other, which subsequently followed the other. So it wasn't a case where the thousands of people came and said, all right, we want internal self-government. Britain, give us internal self-government. No, nothing of the sorts. You had a process where you had the riots, then there were negotiations, the trade unions, then you would have the formulation of a new constitution, which in Jamaica would have been 1944, would have been the year for other countries. Then you would have had the emergence of cabinet. And then over time, cabinet would have been expanded to include different ministerial portfolios. And then you would have seen the inclusion of a chief minister. In the case of Jamaica, it transitioned into a premier. And then you had the prime minister. So it wasn't a case where it was one issue that's an abstract concept that came out of nowhere. You could argue as a counterpoint that if you were to use internal self-government as the most important factor that contributed to independence, you are ignoring, or someone would be ignoring the significant influence that other factors contributed. Internal self-government would not have happened, or you're going to say something different. You can say it can be argued that internal self-government would not have happened if you did not have these political parties which came from trade unions. Or it can be argued that internal self-government would not even be a concept if you did not have universal adult suffrage where people could vote for the first time. I hope that answers the question, Chevelle.
Yes, and also another question. So like when you're arguing like the strongly agree, could you also use the points? For example, you were saying about the emergence of political leaders for like the strongly agree point. Could you bring in the trade unions also as your counter argument? Or you should just stick with the economic advancement?
No, you could use it, you see the thing with the information can be used at your discretion. So
Okay, so
I'm not going to
and
say,
also sorry, go ahead.
I'm not going to say that you should use this and not use this. I'm only
Yeah.
providing you one strategy that you can use.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, no problem. I see another hand. Kiza, I really hope I'm pronouncing your name, Kiza.
Kezia, sorry,
Kezia.
yes.
Sorry, not wearing my
Kezia.
glasses. Yes,
Yes, it's
Kezia.
okay. I wanted to ask whether or not we could be neutral, like we could say self-governance was related to, what was the question again? Sorry. It was related to, but other things, like it was an important movement towards independence. However, there were other aspects or other movements that helped with the independence in the Caribbean. And
Absolutely.
I also wanted to add, since when looking at the Caribbean's independence, it's not just one basic topic or subject, and there are many different types. As I was told previously by some Caribbean teachers, like you could look at many things in the Caribbean for political, social, economic aspects. So would that be a point that I could make as well? Like there are many different types of independence, like the political independence of the Caribbean and the economic.
No, you certainly come in an argument. That's why the point was raised here that you could argue it is impossible to determine what was the most important movement towards independence. Sorry, this should have been independence. As you have political enfranchisement, adult suffrage, eternal self-government, economic enfranchisement, and all of these concepts or all of these movements played a very important role. So you can argue it. You just need to know how to go out and approach the question. So if you're going to argue that it's impossible to determine it, then you have to show multiple benefits of each of the types. So you have internal self-government, universal adult suffrage, etc., etc. You have to demonstrate the knowledge. So just when you're making your responses, ensure that you know how to respond accordingly, because that's important. You have to have the information to back up your point.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, no problem. Do I have any other questions? Yes, I see your hand again, Chevelle.
Yes, sir. I'm asking you, like, where would you go? For like personally for you, which stance would you make?
Oh, you're asking what I would personally make?
Yeah.
Let me think. I would argue the neutral. Me personally, not saying you should do this.
Yeah.
I would argue the neutral point.
Mm-hmm.
Because it allows me to incorporate more information from different elements of the syllabus. So, okay. For instance, you have in other territories persons who contribute to their labor movement, which is a fundamentally important part of the independence process, who did not go on to become leaders of their own countries. I know someone who immediately jumps to mind is St. William Grant, who was somebody who played a very seminal role in the organization of trade unions, and he didn't become a leader. I didn't become a political leader. And different territories will have their own examples. So I will take the argument of the neutral approach because it would allow me to demonstrate greater knowledge. And it will allow me to incorporate all the other points that I normally would have done, minus having to take a firm stance. Not to say that you can't take other stance. You can take that you strongly agree internal self-government was it, and you can write an exceptionally good essay with it. It's just my own personal preference because I like to show off, and it's important that you can show them what you know. That's why I would take that approach.
Okay, thank you, sir.
I see another hand. Aisha.
So it's Aisha.
Aisha, yes.
I was saying that I think remaining indifferent is actually the best way to go, because I think what K4CXC does in saying that the most important is actually leaving room for you to understand that there were actually more. However, they're turning this question in a way to say that you will mainly write on internal self-government. However, in a sense, you're going to have to mention the fact that, there were other things that led to internal self-government. So I personally think that remaining indifferent is the best choice.
That's one strategy that you can take, yes. It's not saying that you should remain neutral. It says that you just be able to support your argument. But that is certainly one strategy that you can take. Let's put it from this perspective. If you are listening to an argument that someone is making, who is more convincing? Is it the person who only gives you the positions in favor of their point, or is it the person who gives you the two positions or three positions and show why they take that approach and the other two positions are not as important or less important to the argument? I would more say it's the person who can clearly demonstrate the different perspectives and then show why their perspective, whether it be strongly agree, strongly disagree, or that you can't qualify it, is most important. I would say that person would clearly demonstrate they have the knowledge of the concept and of the topic at hand.
But sir, can I just say that in probably demonstrating internal self-government, you can present it on a scale where you speak about it, you emphasize on it, you highlight and whatever, but you don't really have to agree or disagree. That is in my point of view. So you can give it on a platter, however, you still mention the others. You don't mainly focus on internal self-government, or you do focus on it, but you mention the fact that there were others that led to it. That's what I meant.
No, certainly, you're right. I'm not disagreeing with you with that where that is concerned, because the question just asks you to discuss the extent to which you agree. That's the important one. Discuss the extent. You can agree with something and not strongly agree with it. Or you can disagree with it altogether. Or you can say to a limited extent. It's important that in your introduction, you state your thesis. Your thesis statement. Your thesis statement guides the essay. And that's where you take a stance. So we are saying essentially the same thing. So that's why I'm just encouraging persons to have an open mind when approaching the question. I think we have time for one more question before we go into the next topic. Do we have any other questions? All right, I am not seeing any other hands, and we are going to move right along. Just so that I'm on the same page, I'm just checking to see if we got any other questions in the chat or anyone mentioned it privately. Nope. All right, so we're going to go and move right along. So we're going to look at the topic of intellectual traditions, which also came on the syllabus. Sorry, not the syllabus, the topics that CXC had released as broad topics to focus on. So it's important that we look at what the syllabus asks us to do. The syllabus asks us to explore the economic and political thought of Caribbean leaders, essentially. You have industrialization by invitation was mentioned, Marxism, and the dependency theory. And from there, I chose the Caribbean Studies past paper 2014, because I think this is a pretty good paper that allows you to, or question rather, that allows you to incorporate the different perspectives that you may have. So this is how the question goes. In the 1960s, the dependency theory attempted to explain underdevelopment in the Caribbean. Discuss the extent to which the dependency theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. So I'm going to ask everyone here, when you see this question, what immediately comes to mind? What are some of the things that you're noting? Anybody, open season. When you see this question,
The
what
proponents of the dependency theory.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Diamond?
The proponents of the dependency theory.
Yes, that's an important point. You need to mention the proponents. Anybody else?
The advantages and disadvantages of the dependency theory.
Yes, you are correct. You're going to show the advantages or the applicability of it. Anybody else? Yes, Anake?
Yes, sir. I'll define what is the dependency theory along with underdevelopment.
Good. You're going to define the key terminologies. Anybody else?
You can talk about what is meant by underdevelopment in the Caribbean.
Certainly. Absolutely. Zidane?
Right. After defining each of the two major components in the statement given to us, I think in essence, what is required is to show how the dependency theory sought to explain, well, it's exactly what it says, sought to explain underdevelopment in the Caribbean. So that's exactly what I'd go for.
Good, good. All of you are correct. All of you are correct. You need to look at, sorry, give me 1 minute. You need to look at, firstly, you're defining your key terms. So dependency theory and underdevelopment. That's important. You have to look at what are the key terms and define them. Then you're going to have to look at an explanation of the dependency theory, its applicability. Then you're going to have to look at how it relates to the Caribbean. And then from there, most importantly, you have to look at whether it's relevant in the 21st century. As a person, you can explore the dependency theory, and you can explore on the development, but you don't have to link it to the 21st century. So you also important that you mention and you highlight how it contributes to explaining on the development and discuss the extent to which it is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. That's 2000s here. So we're going to move on from here. Now let's look at what the examiner's report would have said. The examiner's report said this: overall, the question was poorly done. Firstly, very few candidates offered the correct definition of dependency theory, and most could not say who the theorists were. Very few candidates mentioned Sir Arthur Lewis and his Nobel Prize economic thesis of industrialization by invitation, but they did mention the important elements of the theory as expounded by Lewis. Reference to the Latin American theorists was glaringly absent. Responses indicated very little knowledge of what constituted the dependency theory. The end result was a very weak display of the use of knowledge in articulating how the theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. Some candidates addressed development and not dependency theory, while others simply wrote about economic dependence, especially in capitalist countries, but certainly not in the context of what the question required. You see how the question requires you to do multiple things. You first need to look at the dependency theory, what it is. Then you have to look at who said it. Then from there, you see, even though industrialization by invitation is not directly addressed, you see how the examiner expected you to talk about it, which is why I said earlier, when looking at the topics, you can't just look at dependency theory alone in isolation. The examiner is interested in knowing that you demonstrate the knowledge of the whole syllabus. So to demonstrate that knowledge, you have to mention the industrialization by invitation. You're going to have to mention a bit of Marx, but that's not difficult when you know what to do and how to do it. Then from there, you have to look at the ideas that constitute a dependency theory, how it is useful in articulating how it relates to the Caribbean, especially the Caribbean in the 21st century, and then looking at overall your examples to support your point. So how do you answer this question? As always, we start with the context clues, the definition. Definition, definition, definition. It's your anchor. It helps you to, you can get easy marks from the definition. So the dependency theory attempts to explain how economic development, or in this case, underdevelopment of developing or periphery nations, is determined by external influences created by core nations. Essentially, you can just remember a title of a book if you find that you're not able to remember this concept definition. There's a book written by Walter Rodney that says how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And inherent in the title of that book is the definition of dependency theory. So you see how you have a core, which is Europe, and you have the periphery, or you have those countries at the margins, which would be Africa, and how at the end of the day, the periphery is underdeveloped by the core. That is essentially what dependency theory stipulates. And not only is development or the underdevelopment of states like the Caribbean is conditioned based on the factors taking place in the core, but these peripheral nations inherently become, this is the word, dependent or reliant on these core countries. And then you can always go and throw in your theorists. Andre Gonda-Frank is a very important theorist that you could use, or you could use Raoul Prebisch, or you can use the Caribbean's own Walter Rodney. And. So you can throw in your knowledge of both. All of them are pretty much arguing the same thing, and you just need to state it. Andre Gonda-Frank, Raoul Prebisch, and you ensure it's a Caribbean exam, so you ensure your indigenous, Caribbean indigenous thought with Walter Rodney. Easy marks right there. And from there, you look at the theory's main premise is that wealthy core nations contribute to the exploitation of developing countries through resource acquisition, the taking advantage of labor, and the provision of investments. Oh, before I continue, this is how the exceptional student, you can weave in certain things in your introduction. You could simply state that this theory is heavily influenced by Marx. If you are in any exam and you are talking about class, talking about exploitation, Marx is the go-to person. Marx's main premise is that the rich capitalists lead to the contribute to the exploitation of the workers or of poorer individuals due to their inherent greed and desire for wealth. So what we have discussed dependency theory in our introduction, we've discussed Marx in our introduction, and we haven't even gotten into the arguments themselves. So we can take it from there. But before I continue, do you have any questions? Are we all clear? All on the same page?
Yes,
I see I have a question. Archibald?
Yes, please. I was wondering, can you compare the dependency theory to other theories?
What other theories would you compare it to?
So, like modernization, for example.
So let's look before I answer the question, let's look at what the question is requiring. It says discuss the extent to which the dependency theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. And while modernization theory is a very useful theory, the question is, how would you incorporate the modernization theory when we're just asking to look at the dependency theory? It could be incorporated, but before I answer, would you care to explain how you incorporate it?
Well, I was just curious myself because I was reading somewhere how people don't agree fully to the dependency theory, taking into consideration certain countries which may have started their development late, etc.
A useful point.
So
let me ask you a question though, Archibald. Are you a sociology student?
No, please.
Oh, okay. All right. So I won't use a sociology example, but I would suggest if you're going to mention it briefly, but don't spend time on it. Because you are doing 4 essays in a limited amount of time, and your goal as students are to maximize maximize marks as quickly as possible. So you're not necessarily writing a thesis, so you don't really need to go into it. You can simply look and answer the question. So if you're going to mention it, but don't spend any time on it. If you don't have to mention it, don't mention it, because you're just asking to discuss the extent to which the dependency theory, because it specifically asks about the theory, is useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. All right. So from there, it is important that we look at the position. It's an argument. State your position. So your position could be the dependency theory is extremely useful to this explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. You could say it is only somewhat useful, and that there are other factors that the dependency theory is not as applicable anymore to the Caribbean society. Or you could simply say that the dependency theory is not useful, and that Caribbean economies are structured very differently than what they were in the 1960s. All positions that you can take when discussing your essay. I see a question in the chat that asks if you can mention the functionalist theory. I would suggest you don't do that, simply because it's a Caribbean studies exam, and functionalism directly relates to sociology. And even though you may have sociology students that are sociology teachers that are marking your essays, it's important that you not bring up as much specialist knowledge in the topic. It's simply asking you to look at the dependency theory, assess whether it's relevant to Caribbean societies to this day, and you're going to use your examples to suggest whether it's relevant or not. So I wouldn't suggest spending too much time on other concepts not relating to it, because you're going to spend a lot of time explaining modernization, functionalism, whatever, and not enough time devoting to the analysis and the argumentation. For these 30 mark essays, it's the argumentation that really matters. Not as much the content. The content is important to prove your arguments, but it's the argumentation that is important. So as mentioned before, let's see if we can know our positions. So if you believe that the dependency theory is extremely useful to the Caribbean societies today, I'm asking you to use it now. To just raise your hand. All right, just asking one more time if you believe that the dependency theory is extremely useful to explaining Caribbean development right now. In the 21st century, you can raise your hand. All right, 10 people seem to agree, 11 people, 12. Okay, good. All right, I'm asking everyone to lower your hands. If you believe that it is only somewhat useful, I'm gonna ask you to state if you could raise your hand. You only think it's somewhat useful. There are other factors. If it's only somewhat useful, you can raise your hand. All right. So we seem to have an even split there. You can lower your hands. If you are someone who believes that it is not useful at all, you can raise your hand. So if you're someone who believes that dependency theory is not useful, you can raise your hand. All right, no persons. All right, good. So we have an even split between those persons who believe that the dependency theory is extremely useful and those persons who believe that the dependency theory is only somewhat useful. To the person who argued that the dependency theory is extremely useful, could you share why you believe that is extremely useful? This is a time where we can get interactions. Why do you think the dependency theory is extremely useful? Don't go all at once, guys. If you think the dependency theory is extremely useful, please state it. Why do you think the dependency theory is extremely useful? All right, don't see any takers. All right, let's. Yes, I see. Yes.
I would like to try, not sure, but.
No, please, go ahead.
I would say that with the dependency theory, I thought that it could apply to tourism because the sources of the Caribbean are used and they're taken over to the developed countries, and the developed countries basically make the most of these resources, and it brings about this economic development at the expense of the Caribbean. But like also the Caribbean kind of allows it sometimes. So it's like selective exploitation.
All right.
Basically, that's what I'm trying to say.
Good. You have raised very, very good points. Extremely good points. I'm going to get right into that soon. Chevelle, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, okay. So I think that it's also important when you think of like with exports and imports, how like we export our bauxite and like we export like raw material and have to like repurchase like the aluminum and the aluminum for like pots and stuff like that. So we are like dependent and we're losing money basically because we can't manufacture because of the high prices. So I think that we're dependent and we can't really produce as much. So dependent on the bigger countries to produce and make things for us.
Brilliant. Absolutely correct. I see Anna K, your hand is up.
Yes, sir. I'm just going to evaluate on what everyone else says. This can also happen in the case by which the mother countries loan us monies and everything, and instead of we investing all those money in ourselves, we are busy trying to repay them back, and that results in something called culture of poverty, etc. I'm not sure if it's correct.
Good. Yes, you are correct. You are correct. And I see lastly, Jay.
Yes, sir. Why the dependency theory is extremely useful is because it explains why we as a region, the countries in the Caribbean, we are still third world countries, even though we have a lot of money coming in from tourism and other activities, because we have basically been raped of our resources from those big countries, and we don't have anything for ourselves anymore. So now we have to go back to those countries to try and get funds from them and so on to develop ourselves, basically.
Good. Whoops, I heard someone.
Sir, good morning, everyone. In addition to what everyone else had said, I just wanted to raise a point, something along the lines. The fact that we don't really have a lot of things for ourselves out here. I mean, we have the resources and so on, but we don't have the money. So, in addition to like industrialization by invitation, I think we lower our price of goods and so on to attract investors from overseas to come and invest in our country. And the fact that the majority of the money that they are making out here, it goes back to their country, further developing their country, and then just leaving us with basically what's left. I don't know if that's like a good point, but I was thinking something along the lines of.
Sorry, I was speaking there. Yes, it is a good point that you have raised. I see two more hands up. I'm going to take two last hands. I see Kayla and I see Rihanna. Let's go Kayla first.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. Just to kind of reiterate what I heard somebody said, and also to add or to kind of give an example of what the person was probably saying. The dependency theory, just to point out something, mentions that the core countries, they exploit us. So we have the raw materials, but we don't have the resources, we don't have the people skill to actually make them into finished goods, for example, right? And so they exploit us. We have to sell it to them at a lower cost, and then they resell it, I guess, the finished product to us at a higher cost. I heard, and that would go for the bauxite industry, which is one of our main industries in the Caribbean, as well as tourism. I heard somebody mention tourism, and I just wanted to highlight how COVID-19 kind of brought to our attention how dependent we are on these extra regional countries to come in, because the tourism industry was suffering during COVID-19. And I just thought, with the exception of Trinidad and Guyana, who I think Guyana found oil and Trinidad they have oil, I think that kind of show how dependent we are on these extra regional countries. That's it.
Very, very good point, Kayla. And even, I'm going to argue, even Guyana still demonstrates that dependency, but we're going to get right into that. And I like how you mentioned COVID-19, because COVID-19 really has showed how dependent Caribbean societies are. I'm going to take one more point. So I'm going to take Rihanna's point, and we're going to get right into it.
I do agree with Kayla. Where I was at though, I was thinking that, but I think this leans more to industrialization by invitation, in which we, as the Caribbean country, as the less economically developed country, we invite multinational companies for them to build up their companies, and then we will have workers working these businesses, and they are paid lower wages than what they would get in a more industrialized country. And another thing I was thinking, that we Caribbean country, we are normally not normally, but we're not that educated, so we invite skilled workers to come and work in our country, and that doesn't really the money or the profit that is made by the Caribbean country, by the specific Caribbean country, it does not really stays in the Caribbean country.
All right, great point. Just a clarification with everyone. Just be careful of the diction that you use when you're writing. I know persons would have shared, the fact that these larger developed countries would have robbed us of our resources, which is true, but using terminologies such as raping countries and such, while it is useful if we are doing a speech competition, when we're writing the academic essay, you don't know who may be reading your papers. So just be careful with the language that is used when you're expressing yourself. Another point to note as well includes that point about not being well educated. Let's not say that, because we do have countries that are Caribbean societies that have a very high level of human development. We do produce a very well-educated population. It's just that we have high rates of migration. So it's not the case where the Caribbean people are not well-educated. It's just more the case where Caribbean educated people don't stay. So just be careful with the sort of language that you use. If you're going to use things like brain drain, yes, Camila, that's good. Brain drain, exploitation, loss of resources, certainly. But I would suggest refrain from using a language such as rape and people not being educated and such. So just a point to note. Those persons who had taken the middle ground, so you say it's somewhat useful, but there are other mitigating circumstances. Now is your time. Yes, Zidane.
Before I proceed, I have a question.
Sure.
When probing this question, is it that we have to look only, because in my mind, I think the key thing here to me is to look at whether or not the dependency theory is efficacious in the 21st century in explaining underdevelopment. With that being said, I agree that it does, but to an extent. So I wouldn't largely agree with it. My reason for that is because I think there are other factors. So when I'm writing my essay, if I would have encountered this, I would have said that the dependency theory can be regarded as an external factor. However, in the Caribbean, there are other factors which can be regarded as internal, which leads to underdevelopment in the Caribbean. Some of those which I would have expounded on is the distribution of wealth in the Caribbean. I don't know if I'm going on the right road, which is why I asked the question if we're only supposed to look at if the essay should revolve only around the dependency theory, or is it revolving around the dependency theory being the thing that is explaining underdevelopment, or are there other factors? If that's the case, then the other factors which I'd look at are the internal factors, such as I said, the distribution of wealth, natural and man-made disasters, because, for example, how much money could Jamaica have had if not for Gilbert, right? The human population being developed or underdeveloped, you know, the distribution of all of that, I think, plays an integral role in an underdeveloped or developed Caribbean, which is why I asked the question first. I don't know if I went the correct trajectory, but that's how I'd approach it, hence the middle ground.
Awesome. Thank you, Zidane. And I can say, yes, you are on a very right path, actually. And you don't need to be concerned with whether you are on the right path. I think that you are on an extremely good path. And let me say why. So let's get into the whole question of Caribbean societies. And you know what? I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to bring up a Word document, and persons can go and contribute to the Word document. Persons can go and contribute to the Word document, and we could have a discussion on it. So let me go and reshare my screen once again, because I think, Zidane, you are onto a very important point. Let me share screen, Word document, see here. Or can I do my whiteboard? I think I can do a whiteboard. All right, let me see that. Good. If you are able to, I'm kindly asking for you to show the features of Caribbean countries. Let me do that here. All right, so just throw it on the board. What are the features of Caribbean countries? Our Caribbean economies, our Caribbean societies. Is everyone able to contribute to the board? All right, someone says that they're underdeveloped. Are there any other features of Caribbean societies? Yes, Chevelle.
So how do you access the doc?
You should be able to see it here, where you can look at text. So you see the different icons to the left. You see select, draw, shape, line, text. You select text, and a text box will come up, and then you type the information.
As in, like, where is the doc? I don't see the doc.
Oh, you're not able, is people not able to see the screen? Is everyone able to see the screen?
I see the screen, but how do you just add? I'm confused.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm seeing it right here where I have the icons here. Is everyone seeing the icon to the left of the screen? Would someone else comment?
Yes, sir.
All right, so some persons are seeing the icon, some persons are not seeing the icon. For those persons who are not seeing the icon, type your points in the chat, and I'll add them to the screen. All right, this is small structure. Good. Small.
What about high levels of importation?
All right, high levels of importation. High level of imports. Another person says fragile. Oops. Another person says fragile. All right, another person says low values of exports. Another one says lack of resources.
poorly developed infrastructures.
Yes, poorly developed infrastructure. I may not get to write everybody's points, but I'm going to write as many as I can. Poorly developed infrastructure. I see crime. Oops, someone put crime there. Let's see if I am missing any big ones.
Sir, what about they're more prone to natural disasters?
That's not there. There, that one is an important one. Let's put that one there. Oops. Prone to natural disasters. All right, I think we can stop there. I think we get the general idea of what exactly are the sort of points that can affect Caribbean societies. And let's now zero in on some of these points. We see here, I'm wondering if I can highlight. Let me check here. All right, I'm not seeing the ability to highlight. Let me see. Let's look at someone who discussed, who had written small structure. Yeah, let me put a shape here. Can I do a shape? Can I draw a shape? Ah, good. Let's look at small structure. Yes, Caribbean societies are inherently small. So even though you can have a case of underdevelopment, you have the fact that Caribbean societies are extremely small with resources. You have an example where a Barbados can fit as a parish in Jamaica. And that is the case for many countries in the Lesser Antilles. They're small island developing states. But even larger countries that people think of, like a Jamaica, is inherently small. So for example, Jamaica is smaller than every single African country on the continent. Every single country on Africa, on the continent that is, not including the islands like Mauritius and Seychelles, but every single country on the African continent proper is larger than Jamaica. The smallest country in Africa on the continent, I think, is Burundi. And Burundi or Rwanda, and they're 10 times larger than the size of Jamaica. So even if Jamaica was to develop every single natural resource on the island, it will still be inherently small. So we can argue that it's not necessarily dependence, or dependency still plays a role, but we cannot discount the fact that we have inherently small countries or small states. As a result of that small size, we see where you have a low value of exports, because a lot of your exports are agricultural based commodities, which require good weather, and they're not processed, by the way. So if you're not able to increase on the value chain, the inherent smallness represents a problem for society. Another very, very, very important point is the point on natural disasters. So as Zidane would have shared, when you have a Hurricane Gilbert, that mash up your country and set you back. The finance minister had shared, I believe it was 4 or 5 years ago, that every time Jamaica is hit by a major hurricane, it loses 2% of its GDP. 2% just for one natural disaster, compared to, for example, the United States, where if it's hit by a natural disaster, it will cost money, but you have 49 other states that can contribute to GDP. So one can argue that, yes, dependency theory is important, but there are other mitigating factors that could be used to explain the development prospects of the Caribbean in the 21st century, such as the prone to natural disaster. Another point is high crime rate. And yeah, that makes sense, because who's going to invest in a country where people can lose their investment, or someone could be robbed? Please, if there's anybody who wants to invest in a country that's not safe, you can certainly raise your hand. I don't think I'll have anybody. But that's also another point. Camelia, I see your point about Haiti, but I wouldn't use Haiti for this example because Haiti is a country that has been seriously exploited. And Haiti would be a good example of dependency still playing its part now. So I wouldn't really touch Haiti. I would use some of the other Caribbean territories at play. You could look at the fact, as Deandra said, you can look at Jamaica, or you could look at Trinidad and Tobago. If my memory serves me correctly, I think on a per capita basis, those two islands are in the top 20 in the world for murder rates, just on a per capita basis. Another point that I didn't see anybody mention is this very big one I'm going to type right here. Anyone contemplated corruption?
Yes, sir, because
Yes, sir.
Yeah, corruption. Corruption plays a very, very, very important role. Corruption represents a tax on business. If you have to bribe somebody to get through in government and get through your, let's say, setting up a manufacturing plant, you're not going to come to Jamaica. You're going to go to another country that is more developed. If you have to worry about people are rob you, or you have to pay people not to extortion money, really, which is what happens in some cities like downtown Kingston. Sorry, my apologies, Diana. Yes, you are right. You are right. I'm seeing it here. High levels of corruption. Yes, definitely. Yes, corruption is here. That is something that is very, very important as well. The economies of states lose billions of dollars just due to corruption alone. So you see how you don't really need to be locked in. Let me close this down. You don't have to be locked in to any particular perspective. You can explore a myriad of details that would contribute to why Caribbean societies are not as developed. So we're going straight back to the point. Discuss the extent to which dependency is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. If you take the argument that dependency is somewhat useful, but there are other mitigating factors, we have explored it thanks to Zidane's brilliant point that there are other factors as well, such as our small size, such as crime, such as corruption. So dependency is important, and you talk about dependency, but you also look at the features of small island developing states. And the definition of small island developing states are that they are countries that are challenged with resources. A place like Jamaica, which has 2.9 million people, compared to New York City alone, which is 8 million people. Or to show the disparity where you have a China, which is 1.4 billion people. Their capital city, Beijing itself, is 20 million people. So Jamaica is not even a small city in China. That shows the disparity as well. Or people look at a Singapore, which is a very small country, might I add, but Singapore has a population of 5 million people. So you can see now where the smallness can be a disadvantage with resources, despite the mitigating circumstances of the dependency theory. However, if you're going to be someone who says that, yes, dependency theory is the most important point in exploring core economies, here are some points that you can use to support this. So the region sells resources cheaply to the core, for example, bauxite, and pays much higher resources for finished goods needed for production, such as motor vehicles. That's a very important point that you can throw in. We all know what it is. We mine bauxite cheaply, we process it overseas, we import it. So that shows dependency. That shows what we're underdeveloped as well because of the disparity that takes place. Another point to note is that core nations provide capital, such as foreign direct investment, which is needed for local economic development for the tourist industry. Most of the large tourist organizations or companies are foreign owned, the Spanish hotels. We do have local owned hotels, such as Sandals, which is owned by the Stewart family. But generally speaking, most of them are large companies located overseas. And many of them repatriate their profits. So I mentioned when we first began the example, 42, if you look at Jamaica alone, 42 cents out of every dollar remains in Jamaica from tourism. All of that money made. So for every dollar, that a tourist spends in Jamaica, that is, only 42 cents remains in Jamaica. That was reported by our tourism minister, Edmund Bartlett, in 2018, I believe it was. That shows dependency, because we're not keeping the money, even though it's made here. It goes back, whether it be due to repatriation of profits or we're paying imports. What makes this example so stark, because we don't want to only focus on Jamaica, is that within the Caribbean, only 51 cents is the highest any country has achieved in terms of the money they're able to make from tourism. And that country that has the 51 cents of every dollar is Dominican Republic. Outside of that, all other Caribbean countries fall below Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. Most of them only retain around 30 cents per dollar. So certainly that shows dependency because of how we rely on the core. I see a point raised in the chat where JD had said another point is the mismanagement of resources in Caribbean countries by their respective leaders. Yes, goes right back to the whole issue with corruption. You can look at the fact that a good example that could illustrate the cost of corruption in the long term is the World Bank school building loan scandal in Jamaica that took place in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And why I use this scandal is that to provide a bit of context, Jamaica got a loan from the World Bank. I think it was the largest loan given to a developing country in the late 1960s to build schools across the country. However, the state minister responsible for education changed the contracting process to allow for individual members of parliament to suggest contractors. The consequence of that was that the project went over budget. And not only did the project go over budget, but contractors pocketed the money from the school building loan, which resulted in 100 less schools were constructed than was planned due to this rampant corruption that took place. That is an actual example that took place in Jamaica in the 1960s and 1970s. You can look up the World Bank school building loan. You can write it down. You can do your own research. The National Integrity Action did a very good documentary on it, on the cost of corruption. So you can take a look at it. So I see your point, Selena, about our former minister. Just letting you know that's still before the trials. So it's alleged. It hasn't been proven. Wouldn't suggest that example. I would use other examples that shows that has been proven and documented that shows instances of corruption. Because that shows, the example that I just presented you shows that, okay, dependency is important, but Caribbean leaders themselves have also contributed to that level of underdevelopment. Because you can look at, if we had invested more money in education, we would have been much better off. So that's an example. So going back to the issue with tourism, we don't maintain much tourism earnings in Jamaica and the Caribbean. The highest is the Dominican Republic, which is 51 cents. Then, and if you need to find out the sources, you can always go and send a WhatsApp message in the group, and I will be happy to share those with you. Another point to note is the fact that governments also give very lucrative deals to foreign companies. For example, Guyana with oil. So someone had mentioned the fact that the COVID-19, but with the exception of Guyana, the Caribbean economies were heavily dependent on COVID, were heavily impacted by COVID-19. Brilliant example, use it in it because it shows how we are dependent on foreign industries. So certainly use that example, it's a relevant example. But you can also show how countries that you may not think are dependent are in fact dependent. And let's look at Guyana, for example. Guyana recently discovered oil and they had a deal with this foreign company in the core, Exxon, where Exxon could deduct up to 75% of their earnings from its Guyanese wells as the cost before the balance is split between the government and the company. So essentially, what this essentially means is that Exxon doesn't have to pay out as much money to the government because they're able to take all of their costs from their earnings before that is calculated. This was published in The Guardian yesterday. And The article also went on to state that the government of Guyana didn't have the resources to audit these statements that would have been made by Exxon. What does that show? The dependency. Because we see here where countries may make lucrative deals to these foreign companies in the core, and they're not benefiting as much because of the exploitative relationships. Moreover, foreign companies also own very lucrative assets. So for example, just going to use Jamaica because it's a very good example. There's a Chinese firm, China Merchants Port Holdings, is now in complete control of Kingston Freeport Terminal Limited, which is an entity responsible for managing the port of Kingston. This is current news. This took place in the 21st century. So we see here where, because we're so reliant on the foreign investments, even large assets, such as our ports, has been privatized, not to even Jamaican holders, shareholders, but to foreign companies, companies in the core. Caribbean economies are also unable to develop local industries due to the importation of cheap products. So for example, food, that completely destroys a lot of industries as well. And core countries, due to whether it be structural adjustment programs, we bring in knowledge here, whether it be due to the structural adjustment programs or trade liberalization or free trade, quote unquote, that causes the destruction of local industries, and we are now independent on foreign food. Another point to note is that it's important for candidates to acknowledge the work of Arthur Lewis' industrialization by invitation model. The main assumption about the model is that the economic structure of the Caribbean the main assumption about the model is that the supply of labor is unlimited, which results in unemployment. Lewis proposes that rapid industrialization using labor-intensive manufacturing and agriculture development was the solution to overpopulation and unemployment. To facilitate the process, here is the important linchpin. Foreign capital investment should be encouraged. This would assist with the creation of a local entrepreneurial class. However, let's evaluate it. Let's see how we can still see the signs of dependency. Let's look at the criticism. So yes, you had economies that grew rapidly, such as Jamaica, which grew by 14.1% in 1956. But despite the fact that you got high growth, the jobs that were created was less than the increase in the labor force, which means you're getting more unemployment. It hasn't solved your unemployment problem. Moreover, local entrepreneurs also furthered the cycle of dependency by importing technology and raw materials. So I'm going to read an extract. This is from Michael Mann, Jamaica Struggle in the Periphery. So this is written by the former Prime Minister, where he was talking about the whole dependent nature and the challenges with the industrialization by invitation model, where he said, let me find the exact quote. But while I look for the quote, are there any persons who may have any other point that they want to add? No points? Are we all clear? Yes, Kayla, you can use the free zone model. The free zone model is very, very helpful. I think this is the point. Where he said, in 1962, Jamaica was deeply concerned about unemployment, which stood at 12%. By 1972, this figure was at 24%, with the rate of youth and women the unemployment rate for youth and women in excess of 30%. If you look Jamaica now, even though Jamaica's unemployment rate has gone down to, I believe, 7 or 8%, if you look at the youth unemployment rate, it is still very high at over, I believe, 20%. And youth unemployment is always higher than the natural level of unemployment in Jamaica. Another point is looking at, I'm trying to find the point that he had raised. I think this is it. Where this is what the former Prime Minister had said. As a consequence, the new factories tended to import nearly everything that they used. So the establishment of a whole new manufacturing capability must either replace imports or create exports, only marginally it is likely to be directed at a completely new home market, which it creates. Therefore, as years pass, the economies of the model should assist the country to become less dependent on imports and strengthen their export situation. But in the Jamaican case, from about 1953, when Jamaica began to apply the model, that's the industrialization by invitation model, to 1968, imports rose from $86.6 million to $416 million. When the model began, the value of export was already dangerously low at 83% of imports. 15 years later, far from improving, the situation had worsened. By 1968, exports had fallen from 83% to 78% in imports. Now, this is a very important point here. Raw materials, which should not create an increase in drain on foreign exchange, were doing exactly that. 30% of earned foreign exchange was devoted to raw materials in 1953. So what we see here is, despite the fact that we have this industrialization by invitation model, the dependency theory is still applicable because we're spending so much money on imports to facilitate the manufacturing process. And now, 50 years later, we still spend a lot of money on imports to facilitate the manufacturing process. So we can argue the dependency theory is so applicable now, today, in today's society, because the same challenges we saw then are still represented now. Now, going into another point where we looked at, we talked about local entrepreneurs further in the cycle of dependency and how the reinvestment on foreign capital was low because all the profit was being repatriated. But there were reports of abuses in free zones and foreign-owned factories, such as the garment factories. And I believe someone had mentioned it in the chat. That is also something that is incredibly important when looking at the exploitation of individuals or the exploitation of labor. Do we see any other business in the Caribbean currently that may pay their wages, pay low wages, or could exploit persons? Has anyone noticed any other industry that could be guilty of that?
Sir, did you mention kind of harbor engineering check?
I heard two good points so far. I heard the foreign-owned engineering companies, yes. Those from China, yes, there are reports of abuse, but we tolerate it because we can argue that it provides employment. So the same strict labor standards that may apply locally may not apply to them. There are articles you could use to support that. And we also heard the BPO sector as well, which is also an example where many BPOs are foreign-owned. They're owned by foreigners. And we do see continued reports of abuses taking place. However, we hear that governments, successive administrations across the political divide have not provided minimum worker protection because of the concern that the BPO, it will cause the BPOs to go to other markets. And as a consequence, we will lose the employment for the sector. Additionally, no BPO worker is unionized. Workers are not allowed to be unionized. So it's ironic, and this is just my own personal interjection, it's ironic that we have we have societies that were created by trade unions, but 60 years later, we see these same parties that were made from unions are undermining their own work with unions because of the need to attract these foreign investments that are needed to fuel the economy. And the BPO is a good example, and engineering is a good example because you can use it, it takes place now, because the BPO sector contributes to reducing unemployment. That is one of the reasons why unemployment is so low. As a matter of fact, we have a labor shortage though, because BPOs don't have enough people to employ. But they do contribute to a lot of abuses taking place in the workplace. So we see how the dependency theory is still relevant. So a basic recap. When discussing this theory and looking at the dependency theory, you can take the approach that yes, the dependency theory is very applicable. Or you can also take the approach that it's somewhat applicable, but we cannot dispute other mitigating circumstances. If you take that position, ensure you're throwing other mitigating circumstances. You can't go wrong with the small island states. You can never go wrong with that. You can't go wrong with corruption. It's not due to the foreign companies why governments in Jamaica or other countries may be perceived as corrupt. That's due to local leadership challenges. You could look at institutional weaknesses as well, or the lack of training. Many persons may not know this, but I believe it's over half of the population in Jamaica. I can only speak for Jamaica as a journalist from Jamaica. Over half of the labor force in Jamaica does not have a verifiable skill. So how can people become developed when people don't have the skills? I'm going to look for an article that I wrote, a column that I wrote about the matter. I will send it in the WhatsApp group where it says, to give you the precise statistic, the 2018 survey of living conditions released this year, what this year would have been last year, so 2021, showed that 65% of Jamaicans between the ages of 25 to 54 have no examination passes whatsoever. So we're not talking about CAPE, you know, we're talking about CXC and CAPE. They have no examinations whatsoever. And Statin's 2018 annual labor force survey revealed that 61% of the entire workforce did not have any professional certification. So how can a country become developed if people don't have the skills? So that's another mitigating factor that doesn't have to do with dependency theory. I'm going to send it in the WhatsApp group right now. And you can also take a look at it because it illustrates another mitigating factor that has impacted the sector. So I sent it to the WhatsApp group, so you can also have a look at it. All right, so it's now 11:57, and we're going to take a break here in the next 3 minutes. Before I take the break, let me ask, do we have any questions? Do we have any questions? Please ask the questions. I'm here to answer any question. Yes, a question.
So I was thinking about how, like, the colonization had brought this education system here, like CXC based. And basically with CXC, right? I don't know if it's other countries, but over here, certain opportunities are limited. Like certain jobs you will not be able to pursue because it's not like very lucrative over here, but they would be more so lucrative in other first world countries. So education and the jobs which you want to pursue but you can't pursue would prompt people to migrate to pursue something that they want and they could actually get their hands on if they just travel somewhere else.
So yes. Sorry. All right. Let's go back to the question and look at what it's asking. All right. Yes. So here's a question. In the 1960s, the dependency theory attempted to explain underdevelopment in the Caribbean, discuss the extent to which dependency theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. If you're going to argue other mitigating factors, you're going to have to say this. All right, dependency theory is somewhat useful, as we have previously established, but there are other mitigating circumstances that contribute to development challenges in the 21st century. Then you tie in the point saying one of those circumstances is the continued lack of the undiversification of Caribbean economies means that there are the absence of certain skilled positions for persons to be employed. As a consequence of the underdevelopment and the undiversification of Caribbean economies, we sometimes see persons, not sometimes, we see persons who are educated migrating to other developed countries like the United States to find employment. This contributes to underdevelopment because the absence of skilled labor means that certain industries are not able to flourish locally. So while the dependency theory is important, it is not applicable or as applicable to the Caribbean region because we have other circumstances such as the high brain drain, which plays a more important role in today's society to contributing underdevelopment. So that's how you would approach it.
Thank you.
I saw another question. If you could go over how I would tie in industrialization by invitation as well as the Marxist approach, certainly. Dependency theory is influenced by Marxism. Marxism is of the view that exploitation leads to the underdevelopment of respective people. Exploitation by rich capitalists, rich industrialists. If you're going to tie it into dependency theory, we just replace capitalists by core nations such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and exploited working class people to periphery nations. Because the dependency theory is influenced, the Marxist theory, it's influenced by Marx. It's just applying Marxism to an international level. Another thing is that if you're going to look at the industrialization by invitation only perpetuated the issue of dependency. If you look at the fact that dependency, the theory heavily influenced the development policies advanced, the development policies advanced by developing countries, then you can look at the fact that in the 1950s and 60s, when the dependency theory was applicable, or most applicable, Caribbean governments provided generous incentives to foreign investors to come and invest in the area. But this contributed to the development, the dependency even further, as you saw circumstances where we saw repatriation of profits, we saw still high levels of unemployment. This is still relevant to this day because we still see where Caribbean governments wanted to incentivize foreign investors to come to Jamaica, such as the tourism industry and the BPO sector, but we continue to see cycles of exploitation taking place. So that's how you would link it. We're gonna go now and take a 1 hour break, and we're gonna resume at, we are going to resume at 1 o'clock using the same Zoom link. I will be sending the WhatsApp group link in the chat so you can go and have access to it. We're going to take a break now. I'm going to answer some questions when we get back from the session. I just want to ensure that we have a full hour to go on break. So we're going to break for now. We're going to return at 1 o'clock using the same link. We're going to start very promptly thereafter. If you have any questions, you can shoot them in any of the 2 WhatsApp groups. If you're not in the group, just kindly wait. I'm going to send you the link so you can go and join the WhatsApp group. This has been the first start of our session. Thank you very much for attending, everyone, and we will be back shortly.